Good morning from WKYT News. I'm Bill Bryant, hoping you're enjoying your weekend. There is only one day left in the 2016 session of the Kentucky General Assembly. Hundreds of bills have been debated. Many of them have been passed and sent on to the governor and are set to become the law of the land. But one bill that has not passed is a constitutionally required state budget for the next 2 years. Kentucky expects to rake in more than $21 billion over the next couple of years from taxpayers, and it's up to the legislature to decide how to spend it. If they can't agree by Tuesday, the governor would have to call them back to Frankfort for a special session. That would cost taxpayers an estimated $70,000 a day. If there's no budget by midnight on June 30th, there could be a state government shutdown of all but essential services. Now, later on Kentucky Newsmakers, we'll be talking with House Speaker Greg Stumbo, who leads the Democratic majority in the House. But first, Republican Senate President Robert Stivers is here, and we appreciate it very much. Thanks for coming, Mr. President.
Glad to be here, Bill.
The question I guess we start with, will there be a budget, and why are we asking that a couple of days before the legislature is required to go home?
Well, I'm hopeful, have been hopeful. We have time. I have had many conversations with the Speaker and members of the House, as the Speaker and members of the House have had many conversations with members in the Senate, and there have been discussions with the governor and the respective stakeholders. So I'm still very optimistic. We have had very good, candid conversations. No one's casting aspersions or trying to blow up the process. So I'm still hopeful that we'll have a budget to vote on by Tuesday.
There have been a lot of conversations behind closed doors as you're doing the people's business, and so we're left to figure out what is going on in there. We understand that the deadlock at this point appears to be the proposed cuts to higher education, that the Democrats will not give on that, and that the Republicans are in agreement with the governor of cuts over the next 2 years and with his cut that he's done immediately.
Well, and I think people need to understand where we are in a historical perspective, and as we talked about this earlier, this has been something that has been brewing for many, many years, and that's the unfunded liability of the pension system. And to that extent, we are at a point in time that it is proposed to us, and truly we don't have accurate numbers, but that we have a $38 billion unfunded liability. So it is necessary for everybody to participate in solving that problem, including the universities.
Do you agree with his priority that is where the cutting needs to occur?
Well, he has proposed that 3 areas be exempt: K through 12, the Health and Human Services area, and public protection. And then everything else was on the board. And through the rest of his administration and all the cabinets, they're at 9%. And he plans to try to find more from his cabinets. So the proposal was the equivalent for all other entities or agencies or subdivisions of the Commonwealth.
Does it enter into the discussion that the economy has improved and that these cuts have happened continuously since 2008 to when we had that very tough recession? The result has been, at the university level, has been higher tuition in many cases, and some indications that could happen again.
Well, tuitions have increased no matter whether we have maintained the funding level or increased the funding level or decreased the funding level. But it is somewhat of a concept that can't be grasped because we're having a positive growth, increased revenues, but because the can has been kicked down the road on pensions for so long, our revenues don't exceed our expenditures or needed expenditures specifically related to the unfunded liability of the pensions.
Do you believe the governor has the right to cut allocations that were made by the legislature to programs and to higher education when there is no budget shortfall?
Well, there is language within a budget document, and you can look at various components of the statutes that talk about a budget document takes precedent over statutes. And there is latitude given in the language that the governor can make a 10% adjustment or allotment adjustment within budget units. And there is a provision in the very first paragraph that he can appropriate and disperse money as may be needed, which is a very broad term. And if he feels and has a rational basis for the need to move monies around, he has that ability.
Give us an idea of the gravity of this retirement situation. The shortfalls, there is an estimated unfunded liability of maybe $38 billion. How did we get there and how do we get out of it?
Okay, $38 billion is over a 30-year period.
Yes.
And so you can break that down. So every dollar we put in today will reduce it 5 to 7 times. So if we put in $200 million this year over a 30-year period, that would reduce our unfunded liability by $1 billion at a minimum. So we need to be making that. The problem has been that it's a whole series of problems.
Right.
Life expectancy is greater. The state employees are less than they used to be in the numbers. But here is the gravity, and there's many reasons. KTRS is in a better fiscal position, and that is for teachers. But it is still a tenuous position. KERS for state employees has $2.1 billion in their corpus, their trust, that we draw from to help make those retirement payments. Last year, we spent $900 million out of that corpus. So it dropped from $3 billion to $2.1. The experts tell us if we go below $1.3 billion, we have to go as a pay-as-you-go system, cash fund, and we have to liquidate those assets. And that system will be bankrupt. And we'll be paying out $1 billion a year just to maintain the obligation that we're legally bound to state retirees.
All right, if I oversimplify this, let me know. But if you put in state dollars, $500 million into, and then investments are made that lose $500 million, and we've had some indication there has been some of that in some of those programs, although even the stakeholders don't know a lot about it because there's not a lot of transparency. Then have you gained? I mean, what?
No. And that's one of the things that I would say there is consensus and total agreement on, that these systems, no matter whether it's KTRS or KERS, are going to have to open up their books. You'll have the speaker a little bit later. We are both in agreement, as is the executive branch. These agencies that manage these funds are going to have to open up their books and give us their records and allow us full insight as to what they're doing.
That would be the legislature or the general public?
The legislature and the general public. To an extent, there needs to be proprietary about getting the best deals, but that has to be known at least to the legislature to make sure when you have individuals that are handling billions of dollars of other people's money, that everything is being done appropriately.
So, Mr. President, when you see that there might have been an investment that, you know, just went sour, and maybe there would be expertise within the legislature or even the general public to say, could have told you that was going to happen, would you be able to then have them make changes?
That's what we want to, and we don't have that ability to change the board members and the executive director because the statutes are there, but we all know that we need to have that authority because they have not been performing as they say they have. In years they perform better or worse, but we need the ability to have that oversight. And again, the Speaker and I agree on this. He talks of the days that he was the Attorney General and was prohibited and denied access to those records as the Attorney General.
All right, so you're saying budget, maybe, we'll see. What are the biggest accomplishments out of this 2016 session?
Well, I think maybe one of the bigger accomplishments is that we dealt with the issue related to individuals who can get a restoration of their civil rights and the ability to work where they have had a criminal conviction years and years ago, but then because they've been a rehabilitated citizen, and you know, we talk about redemption and forgiveness, and that was House Bill 40. That'll help a lot of people who have proven themselves to have made young, youthful mistakes to take care of some of those mistakes. I think that may be one of the more significant accomplishments. We're all the time working on various issues related to drugs and drug problems. There's a couple of bills that are still floating around that I think will pass in the last days that will attempt to do that. But I think right now that to me House Bill 40 may be the most interesting bill that we've passed so far.
What's your biggest disappointment in this session? Something you would like to have seen done that couldn't get momentum or did not pass?
Well, there's a few things related to transparency. I think as a public employee and as a legislator, an elected official, that there needs to be transparency in all systems. Senate Bill 2 would open that up so people would know what we are receiving as a pension. That bothers me that that's not out there, that it's not been done. There was an issue on our Senate Bill 1 on changing the education system. We know there's a lot of complaints. We know people are teaching to the test. There are too many testing mechanisms, and Senate Bill 1 failed. And I really think it was a good start. Teachers and superintendents were very supportive of it, but it could get no traction in the House. And those are some real disappointments.
If this goes to a special session and this $70,000 a day cost is incurred by the taxpayers, do lawmakers fear the frustration of the public as to why it didn't get done?
Well, there will always be frustration, and the $70,000 a day, I think people need to be aware of this. The legislature, it won't affect the executive branch, that $70,000, because we maintain a certain reserve, our savings account, that we can fully fund that without affecting the executive branch or the judicial branch functions. And we keep a $5 to $6 million kind of our rainy day fund, our savings account there, but there will be frustration.
One issue down in your district that I understand possibly could get some action before things wrap up on Tuesday, a proposal to allow the city of Corbin to annex into a third county. It's in two counties right now, Whitley and Knox, and there is what's called North Corbin there around exit 29. They want to do some development. It's it's an area that is unincorporated.
It is really a tragic situation because of the boundaries that you're well familiar with, this being your old stomping grounds, that there is an exit that has tremendous potential. And I had proposed some legislation, and I don't have the market cornered on intelligence or ideas, but it's been left behind because nobody really claims it. Nobody really has authority over it. Corbin has placed the infrastructure there, but it's not in the Corbin city limits. And there are numerous people who have signed letters that they would come in and invest multi-million-dollar investments and create jobs if we can remedy that problem. And I proposed something that would be a hold harmless clause for Laurel County, that they would continue to receive the tax revenues off of the insurance premium tax and the occupational tax, which is generally the rub between the cities and counties, but it would help both entities and the region tremendously if we can get that resolved.
Senator Robert Stivers, President of the Senate, thanks for coming.
All right.
Good luck this weekend. And we'll be back with House Speaker Greg Stumbo, leader of the Democratic majority in that chamber, in just a moment on Kentucky Newsmakers. Welcome back to WKYT's Kentucky Newsmakers. As we've pointed out, Kentucky lawmakers have met this session for 59 days, and the Constitution gives them 60. If there is no budget passed by Tuesday, it's going to be on to an expensive special session. House Democrats have been a firewall so far on additional cuts to higher education. They say their plan will bolster public pensions and renew the state's priority for getting more college degrees and certifications into the hands of Kentuckians. House Speaker Greg Stumbo is also a former Kentucky Attorney General. He is joining us this morning. Thanks for being here. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you for having me.
Mr. Speaker, this is a $21 billion spending plan. It appears you're not that far apart, and yet here we are on the brink of the possibility of ending this session with no budget. What's going on?
Well, we have enough money, Bill, as the plan that passed the House shows, to fully fund the pension systems in this biennium, to not cut education, to leave more money in what we call the rainy day fund than we've ever left in it, and to do programs like what we call Work Ready Kentucky, which provides the last dollar in for students that are going for an associate degree at our community colleges or even our private colleges or our public four-year colleges. So it's modeled after what's called the Tennessee Promise down in Tennessee, and what we're trying to do is obviously make a pathway for kids to get a four-year baccalaureate degree easier with less debt than what they have. So there's a lot of money in our growth. We've experienced new growth here. So our position is, with all this money, after the 8 years that we've had of cut in this recessionary times, nobody has told us why we need to cut public education. Nobody has offered any credible evidence. Nobody's offered any credible solution. We have a philosophical difference. You know, they're saying we'll put more money into the retirement systems. We're not necessarily opposed to that. We believe the better plan, though, is to get audits on those systems first to make sure that the money that we give them will be invested wisely to protect our retirees. And remember, that retirement system problem didn't develop overnight, and it's not going to be solved overnight. So why cut public education when we have enough money to do all those things?
Senator Stivers said that you would agree that transparency is a major issue, and you experienced that as Attorney General.
When I was
as well,
Attorney
right?
General, they would not allow me to review the portfolio of the retirement systems for potential litigation. They didn't have to do it. We would simply make a recommendation. Several states at that time were suing the large brokerage firms in New York, and in what we call first chair actions, where the state initiated the action. Alabama, for example, did it and recovered quite a bit more than Kentucky did in one instance that I recall. So what we would have done would have been to analyze their losses and just make a recommendation to the board as to what to do. The board would still have the authority to enter into litigation or not.
So if public money is shifted over and then it is lost in bad investments, the public might not even know about that, right?
That's true. There needs to, the more eyes on those systems, the better those systems are going to perform. I'm telling you, they've started down the right track. You got people like Tom Elliott from Louisville, who's now who's chairman of the KERS board, who's a banker down there, well respected. But I believe the legislature needs an auditing process, much like we have an Office of Educational Accountability, which goes into the school districts and then brings us information to make these decisions on. I believe we need an office like that for the pension systems, because this pension system, no matter what's done this biennium, this situation, is not going to go away. It's a long 35 or 40 year situation that's going to have to be looked at by every General Assembly and every governor.
Governor Bevin indicates that he looked around for places that could absorb cuts, and he believes that the colleges and universities can absorb a 4.5% cut in each fiscal year, and his 9% cut each of the 2 fiscal years, and 4.5% of an immediate cut. You obviously disagree.
Well, let me tell you the fallacy of that, Bill. We asked the university presidents if they had been asked to allow someone from the administration to review their records, to look at their financial situation, to actually do some sort of analysis, and that wasn't the case. So, with all respect, just because the governor believes they can doesn't mean they can without an adverse impact. And what we know is that for every 1% that you cut the universities, it's almost a 1% increase for tuition. So if you want to increase tuition, then these cuts will do that, because the universities have to make up the money in some form or fashion.
What do you say to those who say, well, then that is shifting it over to those who are using the system?
I would say that when teachers, and I had a teacher testify to this the other day that was in Frankfurt, a teacher who graduates who had a $40,000 indebtedness that was a result of their college, that's a problem. You know, college needs to be affordable and accessible. We know that going forward, about over 50% of the jobs in this new economy are going to require 4-year baccalaureate degrees. That ought to be our goal, to make it more affordable and accessible.
Do you believe the governor has the right to cut the allocations to higher education or to any program, even though there is no budget shortfall within the duration of a budget?
My reading of the statute and my interpretation would be different than that of the governor. I do not believe that the governor has that authority.
And Senator Stivers also indicates that he believes there is language in there that gives the governor some flexibility.
Well, if that's the case, then why have a budget at all? If the governor, when there's not a budget shortfall, can just make cuts at the whim of the administration, then there's really no use in having a budget. You know, I asked the governor that the other day. I posed the question. I said, Governor, if you believe that, then just fund education and then let's get a budget, because this is the big sticking point. This is the, 5,000-pound gorilla in the room. And then you can cut them to whatever you want to if you believe that your legal position is correct. He didn't want to do that. I think that the Franklin Circuit Court will answer that question in the negative. I don't think that the governor constitutionally has any appropriation power at all. And the Fletcher case, which I litigated as Attorney General, clearly shows that, Bill. So the effect of being able to cut when there's not a shortfall of money that was duly appropriated by the General Assembly is, in fact, an ex officio act of a portion, of spending appropriation. So I don't think the courts are going to go along with that. I just don't.
How far are House Democrats willing to go to hold the colleges and universities harmless from cuts? Would it include to not having a budget?
Well, there's also in this mix this idea of spending. There's been some talk about performance-based spending, and I believe that that's a good model for our universities. Senator Givens has a model. I don't believe that we ought to adopt that without further vetting. It may be the right model. I don't know. I don't know enough about it, but that's a major change. If there's going to be cuts, what I would suggest is that we put those cuts over to the side, and then as the various things are done, as the audits are done, or as the process moves forward with performance-based funding, then that money would be available for either or.
You have also criticized the money the governor wants to set aside, this $500 million fund that he says could be used to go to pensions if necessary, or to go to other expenditures in state government as needed.
I call it a slush fund because it doesn't exist in law. Now, we have agreed on the terms and conditions of a bill that before the House would move forward with any budget proposal next week, we would insist the governor sign that into law. I wouldn't give that authority to a Democratic governor nor any governor I served with. It's just too much authority from a spending perspective.
What position does it put you in to arrive at Tuesday when there's no opportunity to override any vetoes? You pass a budget, and he has the right to line item it as he sees fit.
Well, it's from an institutional standpoint, it's not a very good position to be in, because I think it is an infringement of the separation of powers doctrine to some extent. But in reality, the Senate was never going to override a veto that Governor Bevin, who is of their party, the majority party in the Senate, would ask him not to. I don't think that would have happened anyhow.
Predict a budget or not?
You know, we're so close, and yet we're so far away. It's hard for me to believe we can't come to some resolution. I think everybody wants to. I really do. I think I credit the governor. He brought everybody with the university presidents to the mansion Wednesday. He talked about, what he wants to do, what his goals were. I don't think anybody's being totally unreasonable. I just think that we need to, a compromise is a situation where everybody walks away with something they didn't want, really truly. And it's like a court case, Bill. When I walked out of court, if my clients and everybody were just a little bit upset, they weren't real happy, but they weren't so mad that they were going to appeal or they were going to, be just crazy about it, it was probably a pretty good decision by the judge.
What do you believe in the highlights, the good things that you, in your opinion, have passed in this session? Well,
we've done things like the Mark Hinkle bill, the Look Back bill. We've done things like the public-private partnerships. We've done things like the expungement bill, which was a long-standing, the license bill, the marriage license bill, was very controversial. The prompt pay for Medicaid payments, informed consent. We came to a resolution on informed consent. That issue had been around here forever, and it was divisive. Passed, I think, both chambers by 90% or more of the vote. So, we've accomplished some things, but I still hold out hope that we can do something on the budget front. There's money there. Usually the time that it's hard to have a budget is when there's no money, like it has been the past 8 years.
Biggest disappointment of this session, from your standpoint?
I'll be disappointed if we don't do something about this work-ready program. I really believe that's an exciting opportunity to get our kids off on the right foot, get them into a college or a community college system where they can, start this process and do it in a way that it doesn't burden them with excessive debt, so hopefully they'll go forward and get a 4-year degree. I think it's a very exciting program.
Speaker, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. All right, we'll know here in a couple of days,
In
right?
a couple of days, for sure.
All right, and we thank you for being along. We'll be back on WKYT's Kentucky Newsmakers and wrap it up in just a moment. Welcome back to Kentucky Newsmakers, and so the question remains as we head into this week, will there be a Kentucky budget, the $21 billion that will be sent into Frankfort? How will lawmakers agree on spending it? We'll find out as we go along. Follow me on Twitter at KY Newsmakers, and we'll keep you updated on politics and some other interesting things that come along. Don't forget, of course, to join us for the latest news on WKYT and WKYT.com. In fact, I'll see you bright and early this week on WKYT This Morning. We begin at 4:30, on mid-morning at 10, and on WKYT News at noon. Certainly hope you make it a good week ahead.